All right, now here goes. For the past 6 years, my younger sister Sarah has been living with me rent-free. I am 32. It began as a transient solution, a handout for a single mother in crisis. As her older brother, I had the space and felt as though it was the appropriate behavior. At 19, Sarah started to conceive. She and our mother lacked the means to manage the complicated scenario that presented. I therefore got up, thinking it would be a few months, maybe a year max. Come stay with me. Though it was a little 3-bedroom, 1-bath house, my home was mine, a monument to years of saving and diligence. I felt good about it and wanted to give Sarah and her newborn that consistency. Time, as it does, kept running forward. A few months stretched into a year, then another, then still another. Sarah was not a total load. When she could, she helped with chores and shopping. She kept her area neat. She did not pay rent, nevertheless. Knowing she was hurting, I didn't ask or want to be that person. Living continued. Living with me, she had another child. Don't even inquire about the father. My house basically became her house. There grew her boys, my nephews. One part of me thought I owed her something. Our early years were not easy. We were poor growing up, and I always wanted to be better, there for my family when they most needed it. 4 years ago then, I met Emily, the lady destined to be my wife. She was fantastic. She knew exactly how Sarah's overall life circumstances stood. Emily said little for the first couple of years, simply the odd, "When do you think Sarah will get her own place?" But she was patient and understood it was difficult. Things started to alter when Emily moved in formally last year. She found it difficult to live in a house where another woman and her 2 children were already settled. Unspoken conflict and a feeling Emily couldn't completely claim the house, since Sarah had already claimed territory, existed. And it is here that everything truly started to go bad. Emily has always enjoyed working in the yard. She has been assisting her grandma in her garden since she was a little child. It is in her blood. She had always imagined owning a small patch of ground to care for. So, a few weeks back, one evening following dinner, we were discussing the house, and Emily had this notion she had. She wanted to start a garden and rip up some of the front yard. She envisioned flowers, plants, perhaps a little seat where we might sit together. To be honest, it sounded very beautiful. Our yard consisted only of grass and a few depressed-looking shrubs. Since Emily was so thrilled about it, I gave her the go-ahead. I reasoned that a garden would clean the area. We discussed employing some landscapers to handle the first tasks: grass tipping, soil preparation, and layout of everything. Emily wanted to take a few days off from her job to oversee and guarantee proper completion. Like a strong proposal. Here I messed up right now. I ought to have mentioned this to Sarah. Indeed, it is my house. Hence, theoretically, I owe her no justification for what I do with it. Sarah had been living there for 6 years, though, and her children used that area of the yard constantly. Though legally it wasn't her space, she had lived there for so long that I should have warned her. Nevertheless, I did not. Emily and I hardly saw Sarah that week. Our schedules are erratic. She normally stays with me throughout the day when I'm at work. By the time I get home, the boys are in bed, and she is relaxing for the evening. Since I knew she wouldn't be particularly interested, I really didn't think it was a big problem. When I look back, that was a foolish presumption. Then fast forward to the day the landscapers were scheduled to visit. Emily rested the day to deal with it. Totally unaware of the turmoil about to develop, I was at work. Arriving sharp and early, the landscapers began to demolish the front yard. Emily was out with them, ensuring everything was running as expected. From what she later told me, initially it was good. She greeted Sarah good morning, who hardly paid her any attention, and then carried on with her work. Then Sarah became aware of what was happening. She lost it when she watched the laborers trashing the grass where her children played every day. Emily reported the yelling began suddenly. Demanding to know what was going on, Sarah rushed out of the home in her pajamas. She charged Emily with destroying the yard and removing the only place her children could play. Emily tried to tell Sarah she and I had already talked about it, but she wasn't having it. Emily's account of things suggests Sarah was screaming. She screamed at the landscapers to stop and informed them they were not allowed to touch anything. "Actually, you don't get to make that call. This is our house," Emily stated, stepping in. "I've lived here for 6 years. It's my home too, and you don't get to come in here and tear it apart," Sarah shot back. And that's when everything descended from bad to terrible. Our neighbor Brenda apparently heard the ranting and chose to intervene. Brenda and Sarah are quite friendly. Their children occasionally play together, and they have connected over the whole single mom experience. From what Emily told me, Brenda visited and sided with Sarah right away. She began probing Emily about what the staff was doing and why Sarah knew nothing about it. Brenda wasn't listening while Emily tried to keep cool. She ultimately gave the police a call. Yes, indeed, the cops. I still find it hard to believe. Brenda reported there were illegal workers on the property ruining the yard when she phoned 911. She said Emily's owner wasn't home, thus, she wasn't entitled to make adjustments. The cops arrived really promptly. I suppose in a quiet neighborhood like ours, they have little else to do. Therefore, things got quite hot. Emily tried to explain that we were married, and she lived there too. Thus, she did have permission. The cops told Emily she had to leave for the evening, though, as I wasn't present to verify anything. She grabbed an overnight bag, and then they actually walked her out of our house. When all this fell apart, entirely unreachable, I was at work. I work at a warehouse. Hence, during my shift, I am not carrying my phone. Not until I checked my phone on break and discovered around a dozen missed calls from Emily did I even know any of this had happened. I felt like a total moron. Early from work, I jumped in my car and drove the entire hour home, trying to make sense of what the heck had just happened. When I came in at last, the first thing I noticed was Sarah seated on the couch, absolutely calm, surfing her phone as if nothing had occurred. My wife, meanwhile, had been ejected from her own house. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked, "Where's Emily?" Sarah turned to gaze, all innocent, like it was the most clear-cut thing in the world. "She left," she said. "The cops told her she had to." Her voice set off something. "Why did you phone the police on her, Sarah? What the hell is going on?" She then started spinning her defending tale. She had no option, she said. She went rambling on about how she had lived there for 6 years, and how Emily came in and started altering everything without respecting her. Emily and the staff were demolishing her kids' play area without warning her. She had to do something about it. "You don't get it," Sarah said. "This has been my home too for years. You not just get to rip off the yard without telling me." What I was hearing amazed me. After years of supporting her rent-free, my sister, who had been living there, was speaking as though she owned my house. "Your house?" I asked. "Sarah, this isn't your house. You've been living here because I let you. I've helped you out for years, and you repay me by having the police involved and having my wife kicked out." She then withdrew the victim card. She began to cry, talking about how much the yard meant to her children and how nowhere else they could play. Though I love my nephews, I was not unsympathetic. Her handling of this was inappropriate. Rising in voice, "You screamed at Emily," I exclaimed. "You embarrassed her in front of the workers, dragged the neighbor into it, and called the police. Who does that?" Rising from her seat, Sarah began screaming back, as though she were attempting to equal my intensity. "You and Emily didn't even tell me. I had to find out when strangers were excavating the yard. You don't just get to change everything without first talking to me. I have lived here for 6 years. I have a say in this." I stop. "You have a say, Sarah? You don't pay rent. You don't own this house. You've been living here because I've been helping you out. That doesn't mean you get to call the shots," I said, literally stopping mid-sentence because what she said was so crazy to me. She then remarked, the statement that set my blood boiling, "I have tenants' rights. You can't just do whatever you want anymore." Froze. "What did you just say?" Sarah crossed her arms and repeated, more subdued but strong this time. "Legally, I have rights too. I have tenants' rights. I have lived here for 6 years. You cannot simply kick me out or alter things without notice." At that time, I had to go. Not even could I glance at her. Trying to cool off, I walked outside and settled on the porch, not out of anxiety, but rather because I was so enraged. My hands shook. Emily phoned me from out there. She was staying with her sister, and I heard her clearly agitated, her voice cracking. "I can't believe your sister did that to me," she added. "I'm your wife. The cops told me to leave our house." Hearing how badly she was treated infuriated me. I said I would take care of it. "Emily, this is the last straw," I said. "Sarah has to leave." After a time, I returned indoors. Still seated there, Sarah seemed as though nothing had happened. This time, I did not sugarcoat it. "You should start moving out," I advised her. Startled, she raised her head toward me. "What? Keeping me out over a garden?" "No," I replied. "I'm kicking you out because you think you have more of a right to this house than my wife does. This is my home, Sarah, and you crossed a line." She began crying once more, saying I was being cruel, that she had nowhere to live, that I was favoring Emily over my own sister. Perhaps I was, but just then I didn't give a damn. I was not going to allow her to treat my wife disrespectfully or act as if she owned the house. I told her, "You have until New Year's to find somewhere else." "I'm serious. I'll help you pack. I'll help you find a place. But you're moving out." Sarah slammed the door shut as she hurried straight to her room. I merely stood there for a minute, totally exhausted. I called a lawyer the following day to inquire about tenants' rights generally. Should Sarah attempt to challenge me on it? I wanted to avoid surprising everyone. Since Sarah had been living there for so long, and since she had never paid rent, the attorney stated she might theoretically have some residency rights, but it would be simple enough to evict her without a lease. I only needed to give her appropriate written notice. I thus did exactly that. That evening, I prepared an official note, printed it, and presented it to Sarah, tears in her eyes. "You're really doing this?" she asked me. "Indeed," I replied. "That's time, Sarah." I felt horrible, as naturally I do. She is my sister, and I love her. But this transcended the yard now. It was about respect, limits, and the reality I had to put my wife first. I texted Emily that evening, sharing everything. She returned home the next morning, and I knew I was doing the right thing when I observed how relieved she seemed to be back in her own house. For the balance of the week, Sarah avoided interacting with either of us. She stayed in her room or brought the lads to her friend's place. Though I didn't press her, I also didn't back down. For the first time in 6 years, I felt as though I was reclaiming control over my house. The next several days were strained. Sarah spoke hardly to me, and the house felt like a battle zone. She stayed in her room with the lads, only leaving when necessary, most likely expecting I would change my mind if she just laid low. Emily was still offended even though she was back home. None of this was deserved by her. She opened her overnight bag the first night back, and sat silently on the side of the bed. She shook her head when I tried to say I was managing it, and apologized. "I know it's not your fault," she added, "but your sister humiliated me in my own home, our home. You have to fix this." She had not been incorrect. Brenda, the neighbor, made the decision to stir the pot even more the following morning. She came walking over like nothing had occurred while I was outdoors gathering the mail. She wore that phony smile, the one people use when they are going to say something patronizing. Brenda leaned against the mailbox like she owned the house and said, "Hey, I just wanted to check in on Sarah. She told me everything that happened. You know, I just feel horrible for her." It's not easy for single mothers. Trying to cool myself, I looked at her for a second. "Brenda, I'm going to stop you right there. This is between me, my wife, and my sister." "What happened here?" Brenda blinked as though she could not believe I had said that. "Well, I'm just looking out for her. Legally, she's lived here she does have rights." "Stop," I said, cutting her off. "You had no right to get involved. Emily lives here. She's my wife. You called the police on my wife, Brenda. Do you have any idea how messed up that is?" Brenda put her hands defensively forward. "I didn't know she was approved to implement those modifications." "That's exactly the point," I shot back. "It's not your problem. You live somewhere else, and you have no say about what happens on my property." Her smile disappeared then, and she started to look sour. "Well, I guess I'll stay out of it then," she remarked with a slosh full of attitude. "But just so you know, Sarah shouldn't be dumped over a garden." I ignored answering. I turned around, returned inside, and locked the door behind me. I stopped trying to be courteous. She obviously still didn't grasp it. So later that day, I sat Sarah down for another chat. She was in the living room folding clothes, while the lads were playing video games. She was avoiding me, and I knew this, but I couldn't let things continue on anymore. Sitting opposite her, "Sarah," I continued, "we need to talk." She looked up, not at all. "I know already what you're going to say." "Good," I responded. "Then this won't take long." I passed her the official written notification I had earlier produced. She had 60 days to move out. Hence, it was essentially a repeat of what I had said before. I would assist her in finding somewhere, should she need it. At last, Sarah looked up at me, her face austere. "You are rather serious about this?" "Surely I am." She let out a sour laugh. "Unbelievably. You're really throwing me and my kids out over some stupid grass. Do you even hear yourself?" Trying to keep cool. "This isn't about the grass, Sarah," I said. "This is about how you handled the situation. You screamed at Emily. You embarrassed her. Then you let the neighbor get involved and phoned the cops. You crossed the line and you know it." Tears in her eyes, she shook her head. "Where are we supposed to go, huh? You think it's easy finding a place when you've got 2 kids and no money? You promised you would always be here for me, and that was painful. Indeed, it did. True enough, I did swear to be at her side. 6 years is a long time, though, and I came to see that my assistance had evolved into poison. She expected me to carry her permanently after I had handed her a crutch. I have been there for you, I added gently. For 6 years, Sarah, I've given you a place to live. I've helped with the boys, and I never asked for anything in return. But it's time for you to figure things out. You cannot live here forever. She said nothing. She simply sat there, gently weeping. I felt nearly ashamed for a moment, practically. But then I thought of Emily's appearance when she returned home, how ashamed she had felt when the cops ordered her to leave her own house. I knew then that I was doing morally. Emily and I lounged on the couch that evening and discussed everything. I explained to her Brenda's visit and how I would have shut her down. I also mentioned to her Sarah's tears and the difficulty in following through on my decision. Emily laid her hand on mine. I know it's tough, she continued, but you're doing the right thing. I love you, but I can't live in a house where your sister treats me like I don't belong. This is our home, and she needs to respect that. I knew it. She was right. Still, that made things no simpler. Sarah didn't really try to pack or hunt for a new place as the weeks passed. Knowing she was dragging her feet, I started to cave and let her remain. She said to one of her pals, "He's bluffing. He won't actually go through with it," I even heard. It infuriated me. Though I was not bluffing, I did not want to escalate things. I began researching choices to assist her in moving more quickly, contacting social services about supports for single mothers, getting in touch with acquaintances who might know of rental properties, and even volunteering to assist her with a deposit should she find a home. One day I placed a list of sites on the kitchen counter and emailed her, "Here are some options to help you and the boys move forward. I'm serious about the deadline, Sarah." She said nothing, but I later discovered the list vanished. Things began to change at the conclusion of the month. At last, Sarah began organizing little items, clothes, toys, and some of the children's books. I remained silent about it. I would give her room if she was at last beginning to accept leaving. She actually entered the living room one evening, while Emily and I were watching TV. She remained there uneasily for 1 minute before speaking. "Are you absolutely fine with this? Me leaving like this?" I gazed at her, and for the first time in weeks, I experienced something different than wrath. I became worn out. "Sarah, I love you. You're my sister, but this can't keep going on. It's time for you to start fresh and figure things out on your own. I'll help you as much as I can, but you can't live here permanently." She didn't dispute. She simply nodded, then turned away. Sarah was basically packed by the time we reached the 60-day mark. It was more difficult since the lads seemed to have no idea what was occurring, yet I knew it was the right call. On moving day, I helped put her boxes into her friend's car. When she eventually drove off, the house seemed quieter than it had years ago. That was a difficult matter. I felt guilty for my nephews, but my sister had spent 6 years rent-free. I signed no agreement to be their official landlord. I had to give our house, my wife, and my own family top priority. Looking back, that was a tough choice, but the correct one. Emily and I deserved to start our life together in our own house, free from the stress and contempt. Sarah needed to learn to stand on her own 2 feet. Though it was difficult, perhaps the toughest decisions are the ones that result in the most tranquility and personal development. Story 2. Usually I keep my innards hidden online, but lately I've been thinking a lot about my history. This could get long. There is a lot to examine. To be honest, just putting all of that down seems really healing. In growing years, my family was difficult, like an extra bit in a puzzle fully finished without me. I always felt like the invisible kid. Ethan, my older brother, starred the show. I was only background noise. He has ADHD, and although I understand that it might be difficult, it felt as like my whole life revolved on catering to him. Ethan was the focus of attention always. Everyone, including my parents, orbited him as though he possessed a gravitational force. He obviously didn't want me there from the time I was born. He was 6, and on sight he seemed to despise me rather than be delighted about a little sibling. His envy first surfaced early on, though my mother would tell tales about how he would throw great outbursts every time they paid attention to me. I was too little to remember the specifics. I observed it myself as I grew older. He would grab a toy even if he didn't want it if I was playing with one. It was like the truth I was savoring infuriated him. Birthdays were the worst of it. You understand how, as a young child, they should be a major event? A day to mark unique events? Not for me. Ethan would always find a way to destroy it annually. He would cry, yell, knock over the cake, create a scene. Generally speaking. What response did my parents have? Ethan doesn't mean it. He's just overwhelmed. Or, you know how Ethan gets. After a while, I didn't even give a damn about the gifts. I only wanted one birthday free from his drama's shadow. It never happened, though. It felt as though my parents didn't hear me even as an older person trying to advocate for myself. Ethan always ranked the number one. I used to dismiss his conduct when I was young. I knew nothing else except this. But he was clearly a bully as I grew older. Not only difficult, for no other reason than to establish his authority. He would push, shove, knock items from my hands. He bit me a few times even. Though that sounds absurd today, as a child it was horrific. Oh, he's just being a big brother. Or, you'll understand when you're older, my parents would say. Spoiler alert, I neither understand nor will. Not even the bullying itself constituted the worst aspect. The fact that my parents allowed him get away with it set the stage. They would dismiss every time I explained how much it hurt. Ethan's special requires your patience with him. Since that word always aimed at me, not at him, my skin crawls now. Why was it he not the one learning patience? Why wasn't his self-control taught? Making me feel as though my emotions didn't count was, I believe, what most damaged me. He didn't mean it, they would say over and over. If I sobbed after he struck me or screamed at me, they would soothe him, not me. They seemed to believe I was the reason I lacked more insight. I recall occasionally crying in my room and wondering whether I was acting dramatistically. I might have been overly sensitive. Perhaps I was in the wrong. Still, I felt deep down it wasn't fair. Still, Ethan's actions went beyond me as well. He battled social situations as well. He had few friends, and my parents would try to arrange for him to have playdates. Those were natural tragedies. He would act out, cause disturbance among the other children, and subsequently, they would not want to return. Usually, my parents appeared more ashamed of him than worried about how his behavior affected others. I learned early on, though, to keep my head down and steer clear of upsetting the boat. I started to be the good kid, since I wanted not to aggravate their situation. Being the nice kid, however, did not guarantee reward. It basically meant I went unnoticed. I yearned for a typical sibling relationship, the kind you find in films whereby brothers and sisters watch out for one another. I sought a guardian rather than a tormentor. Rather, I got Ethan, who appeared to enjoy making my life miserable. One of my most clear memories is of my time somewhere around 13, just the three of us. I urged my parents to show me Disneyland. I wanted something unique once, something not including Ethan. They consented at last following days of begging. Ethan was supposed to be left with our grandparents for 3 days, and we had some one-on-one time scheduled. The night before, I couldn't sleep since I was so thrilled. Ethan lost it, though, when he learned about the trip. He yelled, screamed, and even hurled items around the home. He got in my face, screaming that should I try to steal our parents from him, he would murder me. I will admit, I was afraid. Rather of advocating for me, my parents urged me to let him accompany me. It's the only way to cool him down, they advised. I bowed. Though the guilt-tripping worked, I did not want to, and the vacation turned out as a fiasco, as I had dreaded. Ethan stayed the whole time clinging to my mother and refused to ride any of the rides. He moaned about the loudness, grumbled about the crowds, and wrecked what ought to have been a fantastic day for me. I will never forget how wrecked I felt that day. It turned out to be another episode in the Ethan show, instead of my moment. I began to see, by the time I was a teen, just how much my family dynamic had molded me, not in a positive way. Every year that went by felt like the bitterness growing. Ethan was Ethan. Nothing was ever going to alter that. But my parents were the ones with the ability to set limits, to improve things, to shield me. They simply let everything pass instead. I began to consider what life may be like should I be able to escape. More of a steady burn. It was not a flash insight. Little events accumulated like the day Ethan destroyed one of my school projects, since my mom didn't even bother to correct him, and I was getting too much compliments for it. Or when I wouldn't give my dad the TV remote, he lectured me about being more understanding when Ethan threw me into a wall. Spending a lot of time in my room, I considered how unjust it all seemed. My folks were not horrible people. Their ignorance of what they were doing was just total. Though they were only enabling Ethan, they believed they were helping him by allowing him act any way he wanted. And I was falling through the gaps while they were so totally preoccupied with him. I understood I had to leave finally. It was now a need rather than merely a decision. I started considering my route out as college. Not any college, though, unless specifically, where my parents could guilt-trip me into returning home every weekend. I was not going to hang around in our little town. I had to move far away, somewhere I could at last begin to live for myself. I wanted not to be the person who spent their whole life tidying after messes created by others. I began applying to colleges when I was 17, concentrating on those as far away as possible. Researching universities late at night, I would try to picture what it would be like to have my own life, space. I threw all I had into it, like preparing a route of escape. My folks were naturally unhappy to learn. I still clearly recall the evening I informed them. We were seated at the dinner table when I blurted haphazardly that I had applied to a university across the nation. My dad set down his fork as I just told them I was heading to Mars. My mom froze midway through bite. My mother replied, "Why would you want to go so far away?" Her voice beginning to rise immediately. "You have excellent schools right here. What's wrong with staying near to home?" I aimed to keep my calm. "I just want something different. I think it would be good for me." My dad then entered right in. "Ethan needs you here. You know how hard things are for him? You cannot just leave him like that." That remark struck me like a gut reversal blow. Does Ethan require me? Regarding my needs, what about, though I knew they wouldn't understand, I glanced at both, attempting to find the words to describe how much I was drowning in that place. None of them did. "I'm not responsible for Ethan," I answered coolly as best I could. "I have to live my own life." The dialogue then veered in that direction, clearly annoyed, blurting out something I don't think he even meant to say. "We had you so that Ethan would always have someone to take care of him." My tummy dropped like a rock as I fixed eyes on him. My mother got in right away, trying to undo, her voice quivering. "He doesn't mean it like that," she said. "Of course we love you. You are merely part of the family plan, a component of the family strategy." Though I'm not sure if they understood the extent of the devastation those remarks caused, in that instant, everything made sense. I had felt all my life like I was second to Ethan. I knew why now. I was a backup plan, not simply second place. I spoke very little following that. Given what I could say, it was too much to handle to realize that my parents considered me as an extension of Ethan's care, rather than as a unique person. I got from the table and walked upstairs, closing the door behind me. I vowed to myself that evening I was going to leave no matter what it took. I refused to let the expectations of my parents cage me into a life I did not want. Whether they branded me selfish or unappreciative or anything else they chose to toss at me, it made no difference. I was intending to put myself first for once. The following several months spun out. Driven to have the grades required for a scholarship, I pushed myself into my homework. Though it was little, I began saving whatever bit I could from my part-time employment, and I didn't notify my parents straight immediately when acceptance letters began to arrive. Before I delivered the news, I wanted to be sure I had a strategy in place. They didn't take it well when I at last told them I had been accepted to a university all around. Mom sobbed, saying I was forsaking the family. My dad tried to guilt-trip me. Considering they hadn't saved much for my education money to start with, it was ridiculous they even threatened to cut me off financially. But I didn't give a damn either. My grandparents, the only ones who really encouraged me, had already been contacted. They said they would help me with some of the expenses, and offered to let me stay with them until I was ready to head out for college. Though ideal, it was sufficient. I first felt like I could breathe the day I packed my luggage and headed for my grandparents' place. I turned away my parents' last attempts at persuasion to keep me. I felt I was acting morally. That summer, I worked harder than I had ever done, saving as much money as I could, and getting ready for the next phase of my life. Sure, I was afraid. Yet, I also felt eager. I sensed, for the first time, that my future was really mine. Looking back now, I see that leaving went beyond only getting away from Ethan or my parents' expectations. It was about discovering me and demonstrating to myself that I was more than simply a footnote in someone else's narrative. I knew I was ready for the challenging path ahead, even though it was going to be rough. It seemed like entering another world when I eventually headed for college. I could breathe for the first time without glancing over Ethan's shoulder continuously or worried about what my parents wanted. I'm not lying and claiming it was simple. Though they were difficult, those first few months were the freedom I had been yearning all my life. Finding out how to make ends meet was toughest of all. Not that they had anything to contribute anyhow, My parents followed through on their promise to cut me off financially. Still, knowing they were serious about it, it stings. It was more than just money. It was about their meager regard of me personally. After I left, I heard from none of them, not even one call or SMS asking whether I was all right. They made it abundantly evident that I wasn't worth their time if I wasn't ready to play the part they had intended for me. Fortunately, my grandparents backed me. Before I left for school, they let me stay with them for the summer. They assisted in some cost covering to get me going. In his lengthy speech on how I should never feel bad about leaving and how pleased he was of me for wanting to follow my aspirations, my grandpa, I believe it's the only reason I didn't totally collapse. It was the kind of support I would never have received from my parents. I became quite aware of how unprepared I was for the real world upon arriving on university. Most of the children around me seemed to have it all worked out. They had money to spend, loving homes, and no idea what it was like to go at it alone. I was juggling part-time work, debt, and the terrible sense of not belonging at the same time. Pulling late shifts to pay rent and finance textbooks, I was a server in a diner close to the university. I knew I had no alternative. Even though there were evenings I would come home so exhausted, I could hardly stand. I had to make it work, since failing would leave no safety net ready for me. I loved being on my own, even with all the pressure. Nobody was down my neck, advising me to be patient with Ethan, or guilt-tripping me into doing something I didn't want to do. I was in charge, first in my life. It went beyond just financial independence as well. Emotionally, I was at last beginning to separate what I had gone through growing up. Before I was gone from my family, I had no idea how much damage their dynamic had done. I never had the opportunity to sort through how I really felt in high school. I was always so preoccupied with daily survival, but there were evenings in college when I would lie awake in my small dorm room, mentally revisiting events and attempting to organize it all. The fact that my parents had tried so little to help me once I moved stayed with me. Though the total silence was deafening, I wasn't expecting them to ask me to come back or anything. After months of not hearing from them, I began to doubt if deep down they cared about me in their own manner, as I used to believe. Was I really merely an accessory to Ethan's life as my dad had suggested, or did they ever give me any thought? From my grandparents, I began to hear bits and pieces about what was happening back home. Ethan was not managing my absence. He began acting out in fresh ways without me around to help him to cool his rage. According to my grandparents, he had begun harassing neighboring children, acting out over the most minor events, and basically ruining everyone's quality of living around him. Part of me felt bad, as if maybe my leaving I had worsened matters. Still, another side of me felt relieved. It was not my issue to deal with for once. Still, I started to flourish in my new surroundings despite all. I befriended a few close pals who didn't know about my history and simply enjoyed me for who I was. Being among people who didn't treat me like I was invisible or ask me to continually put someone else's needs first was energizing. I began to feel as though I was developing personally, slow, but definitely. Academically, I gave it everything. Though I wasn't the sharpest person in the room, I resolved myself to show that I could achieve on my own terms. Every A I got felt to my parents like a middle finger, as I was demonstrating to them I didn't need their approval or backing to build anything of myself. I aimed for thriving, not only survival. I had a degree, a job arranged, and a sense of accomplishment I had never experienced by the time I graduated. There, during my graduation, my grandparents were supporting me from the stands. Mom and Dad, not a word. Though it still hurt, I didn't expect them to show up. It served as still another reminder of how little I meant to them outside of Ethan's existence. Following graduation, I relocated to a new location and began working for a genuine company. Though it wasn't glitzy, it paid well, and for the first time, I didn't have to worry about money every second of the day. At last, I could start paying off my student loans, and more crucially, start returning the financial support my grandparents had given me over the years. Although they never asked for a dime back, it meant a lot to show them how much I valued all they had done. My grandparents were updating me about Ethan, meanwhile. His behavior was getting worse, and my parents were finding difficulty controlling him. Starting to target the neighborhood children, he had sprayed water on them and screamed at them to keep off his road. One of the parents finally had enough and phoned the cops. Ethan's arrest for pestering kids required my parents to bail him out. Although it didn't surprise me, it made me depressed. Hearing about it, Ethan remained the same he had always been, and my parents were still supporting him. My parents never contacted me once among all this, not even once. They seemed to have written off me totally. To be honest, I approved of that. In my life, they became unnecessary. I was done. I had spent so much of my early years attempting to win their affection and acceptance. It felt fantastic. I was at last living for myself. That silence, of course, cannot exist indefinitely. My phone called one day out of the blue and showed my dad's number on the screen. 6 years of nothing later, they were reaching out. Though I had an idea it wouldn't be great, I had no idea what to anticipate.